Rock and Roll of Ages podcast 2B, as instead of 2A from which we started on Tuesday. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, whatever time it might be when you're happening to tune in to Rock and Roll of Ages, where we discover and we discuss rock and roll and pop music from its beginning to the 80s and beyond. I'm B.A. Bartell, and I'm here with my co-host and friend, Rocky Hatley, coming to you straight from Dallas, Texas.
Howdy.
And we are going to continue our discussion of the Rock and Roll Hall of Famers class of 1986. We're eventually going to go class by class until somewhere down the road we will get to 2023, which hasn't been officially done, but by the time we get to it, it probably will be. So
most likely.
And so where were we at last time? I think we were covering, we did, Fats Domino, so that would put us up to alphabetically
the Everly Brothers.
Got it. And what say you on the Everly Brothers, Rocky?
Oh, gosh. The Everly Brothers were, even though they were in the inaugural class, I think they were underrated because they really kind of... even more than Elvis, kind of incorporated the teens.
Right.
They were a duo, and they, just like a lot of these folks, they came from country, they came from gospel, they came from rhythm and blues, and even Paul Simon talked about that they were there at the crossroads between country and rhythm and blues, and of course Simon and Garfunkel really wanted to sound like the Everly Brothers, and they didn't, which is a good thing because there was the Everly Brothers, and then there became Simon and Garfunkel, which we'll get to at another time.
Sounded differently, and Art Garfunkel had a voice that was more, the Everly Brothers had beautiful harmonies and beautiful voices, but I think Art Garfunkel had a voice that was probably a little more mellifluous and more impactful than, I guess, the Everly Brothers, because they you didn't really hear one or the other step forward like you did with Simon and Garfunkel, like Garfunkel did.
Yeah, and Garfunkel had a bigger range than either one of the Everly boys. So,
the Everlys were and you're right, they appealed, I think, to the teens, although, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, they got the screaming teenagers as well, but nothing to the degree that Elvis did, and I think the Everlys came in a close second with regards to that. So
yeah, and of course then along came the Beatles later, blah blah blah. And speaking of which, their harmonies influenced like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and of course Simon and Garfunkel, and a lot of others.
To list a few more Rock and Roll Hall of Famers, it also influenced the Byrds, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and the Eagles. They all kind of took their prompts from what the Everly Brothers were doing and, just either added to it or amended it somewhat, but they still had those beautiful harmonies. Yes, the Beatles definitely went for the sound of the Everly Brothers as far as harmonies go, and Beach Boys for that matter.
Yeah, and the thing for me, too, is that they had their own sound, and it wasn't just singing. It was rhythmically they had their own sound.
Yes.
With a, don't, with a real percussive guitar. And in fact, Keith Richards said that Don Everly was one of the finest rhythm players in rock and roll. And because it was his, with the, dun, 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 and Wake Up Little Susie and Bye Bye Love and all of those. That is clean Everly Brothers. You hear like 3 bar or 2, you hear 1 bar, it's the Everly Brothers. So
right. Yeah, and ironically, or interestingly enough, I should say, most of their songs were written by the same duo, which was Felice and Boudleaux Bryant. They wrote Bye Bye Love, they wrote All I Have to Do Is Dream. I'm not so sure about Bird Dog, but I know they wrote a slew of songs, so they copied that sound somewhat by utilizing the same songwriting team as well.
Right, but those songs, too, could expand out. Like, for example, that particular writing team wrote a song that the Everly Brothers recorded first that some years later became a big hit for Nazareth called Love Hurts. And Roy Orbison also
Did a version
recorded
of that.
And in fact, that his version was number one in Australia. So
Never really did as much. I think Nazareth's version went higher in the top 40 here in the States, though, if I remember correctly. Even though Roy Orbison's made top 40,
right, yes,
it hovered,
Yeah.
in the lower regions of the top 40, whereas Nazareth probably took it to the
just-
top
yeah.
20 at least, top 10 perhaps. But
Yeah.
it was a different sound for the mid-70s, and it was a harder-edged love song, or lack of love song in this particular instance. But
Right.
It resonated with people for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could think of
Exactly.
songs that Nazareth did that were better than that song, but I think that was by far the most popular song, and that pulled them into the mainstream. So, good point. I hadn't even thought about Love Hurts with Nazareth, or the Everly Brothers. Although, no, wait, they didn't do a version of Love Hurts. That was Orbison.
Well, actually,
it was
the
written
Everly
by-
Brothers recorded. They actually did record Love Hurts. It just
Oh, I
didn't
did not
do
know
anything
that.
for them. Yeah, they recorded it. It's actually not a bad version. It's an Everly Brothers version.
It's not something that you would think would be in their range. Orbison had that higher range that he could sing under Love Hurts, and so did the lead singer for Nazareth, whose name
Right,
escapes me. But
They just did their harmony,
right,
and
so-
they're just their harmonies. Love hurts, love scars, love wounds, and Mars. Okay.
and as pervasive of an influence as they were on all those groups of the 50s, or I should say of the 60s and 70s, most of their top 40 hits were done, their top hits, which they did 15 top 10 hits, they were all done in this 5-year span of 57 to 62. And then it seems like, they just kind of faded in, like all the other artists of the 60s or 50s did. They just kind of, for whatever reason, kind of faded away, but yet they were always out there, and they performed, I think, together till like the mid-70s until they had a fight on stage. I think it was mid-70s at that point, early 70s.
They even came back and they toured with Simon and Garfunkel for a while.
Okay.
And Simon and Garfunkel got back together, and I think that was the 80s and the 90s. Can't remember. I have to look that one up. But I think a lot of the reason is that their sound was their sound, and they didn't really take it anywhere beyond that.
Could say the same thing about Chuck Berry and Fats Domino too. They didn't want to, a lot of those groups of the '60s, the Stones, the Beatles, the Kinks, the Who, Creedence Clearwater. They altered or they changed and progressed their sound to as the music changed during that time span. A lot of those groups of the 50s didn't want to do that. They wanted to remain true to their original sound, and most of them, their careers in terms of record sales and top 40 hits, just not that that's necessarily important, went away during the 60s. And then, of course, you had the popularity of all the British invasion groups and Motown, so that kind of took away from that sound as well. But I digress. So carry on. Let's keep on going about
Alrighty.
anything else about the Everly Brothers you want to talk about? Or
Oh, I'm sure something will come up later, but for right now, let's head on over to Charles Hardin Holly,
Sure, why not?
our good buddy.
Yep, and that was his performing name. His real name, like Rocky says, was Charles Hardin Holly. Changed it to Buddy. I have no idea why, but and actually the other thing that he did was his name was originally spelled. It was Holley. When he became a professional, he got rid of the E and just made it Holly, Hollly, like the Christmas flower. So
Right. Well, I mean, Buddy was a common nickname, particularly in the South and Texas, and I'm just glad it was Buddy rather than Bubba, which is another.
he would have
Bubba
been
Holly.
famous as Bubba Holly.
Yeah.
Charles Hardin Bubba Holly.
Yeah.
Well, Bubba, was that a Texas term or was that more like just Southern, like
No, it's
Tennessee,
it's
Georgia?
it's it's rural.
Okay,
Most it's not necessarily Texas or South, but it is definitely rural.
because I would have thought I would have equated Hoss or Tex with somebody from Texas, but not
Yeah,
necessarily
that well,
Bubba.
that's true too. In fact, well, Hoss is also Southern. My father used to use the term Hoss all the time, like hang on there, Hoss, stuff like that. But and well, Bubba, I know where Bubba came from. It's actually a child's pronunciation, like a baby sister's pronunciation of the word brother.
Oh, no kidding! I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
Bubba.
See, learn something new every day in terms of
He's my
the
Bubba.
thesaurus and
He's
the
my Bubba.
dictionary.
He's my big Bubba. So yeah.
One and I mean,
Okay.
go ahead. Back to
Yeah. No.
Charles
Just
Hardin.
back to Charles Hardin, Buddy Holly. I mean, he's another one that he had his own sound. He had that really percussive kind of, he had what the critics often referred to as the vocal hiccups,
Right.
which is pig, which basically sounds like a cat hacking up a fur ball, but boy, does it work in rock and roll.
Some of his
So,
songs were that Bo Diddley sound too. Speaking of that chunka chunka chunka, he
yes,
kind of took
yeah.
that from the African rhythms that Bo Diddley was imitating when he did that, what they call as the signature Bo Diddley sound. And the thing about
Yep.
Buddy Charles, I keep wanting to call him Charles now, Rock. Buddy Holly was unique in the fact that he, like the Everly Brothers, were both good-looking fellas. Elvis had that smoldering, dark sexuality that he brought to not only his looks but his performance and his way of dress. Buddy was a geek. I mean,
Yes.
pretty much Buddy was a geek. I mean, he had thick black glasses. As somebody
Known
once
to
said, he
this
looked like a
day,
blank curse.
known to this day as Buddy Holly glasses.
Yep, and he was tall and lanky and thin, very polite. He wasn't arrogant or in any way pretentious about himself. I think Mellencamp referred to him as a something along the lines of a complete and utter hillbilly, sort of like John Mellencamp, but that doesn't make their
Yeah.
music any less
Yep. Kinda like
significant
John
or
Mellencamp.
any less in any way. Okay, I'm looking for the word that
Nope,
other
not at
people would
all.
follow it. Influential. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for. And yet, Buddy, and there's an interesting thing I read about, and he inspired other people like kids that didn't have Elvis Presley's great looks or the demeanor of the Everly Brothers and stuff, because they were long time professionals, first in country, then in pop. But he gave inspiration to everybody that was, with all due respect to you and I, people like you and I could just get up there and say, hey, if Buddy Holly can do this, hey, so can I. I can get out there and I may be the complete and utter nerd, but he made it popular for nerds. So nerds of the world unite as far
Yep.
as that goes, because that's what he allowed to do. And so, yeah, that was just a little thing I wanted to add there about Buddy.
Appreciate that. It's very insightful. And of course, the his name for his little band, the Crickets, inspired Lennon and McCartney to choose the name the Beatles.
Yes, they did. Yep. And I remember a comment that John Lennon made on the Ed Sullivan Show before the Beatles did their first appearance. And he asked, is this the stage that Buddy Holly played on? So, I mean, that shows you how influential he was, that John was that impressed. Like, oh, my God, I did, and he and the Beatles and the Stones and the Hollies, who named after Buddy Holly, did Buddy Holly songs.
Yeah, absolutely. And oh gosh, I was something. Oh yeah, with regard like to that percussive basically Buddy Holly just did downstrokes mostly, just ch-ch-ch-ch-ch-ch-ch-ch, as opposed to, a lot of them will do down up, or whatever, which help create the Holly sound.
Right.
Where, like the Everly Brothers, just give it a bar or two, it's Buddy Holly.
Yep. And
Up
the
until,
voice. The
yeah,
hiccupy
and the
voice. The minute you hear a song
voice.
come on, that's his.
Yep.
With a couple of exceptions, but pretty much all the same. Ray Vaughan, Baby Baby, Oh Boy, all those different songs. He had that hiccup. Peggy Sue. So
yeah, you had mentioned at one point that somebody had done of the big tragedy, the Big Bopper, Richie Valens, Buddy Holly, kind of tried to figure out what their career would have been like, and that Buddy Holly was probably the only one. Was that what it was? The only only one of the three that would have
I believe
progressed?
It might have been a Rolling Stone little blurb or something. It was on the anniversary of their death, February 3rd of 1957. It might have been in like 87, like the 30th anniversary or something like that. They wrote a thing saying, like, essentially, if they had survived, if that crash had never occurred, where would they be now? The Big Bopper was basically a radio DJ who was, kind of like a novelty hits that he did. Probably wouldn't have done much. Richie Valens, even though he was like the first Hispanic, Mexican-American to get into the Rock Hall, he may or may not have been able to continue that career. Buddy Holly was getting more innovative and doing different things, like using an orchestra and some string instruments on songs like Every Day and It Doesn't Matter Anymore, where it was a different sound for him. So it shows he was sort of a la the Beatles. He was progressing from what was the original sound to something different, and he probably could have gone on to continue doing stuff in the 60s and 70s. Unlike some of the other artists that were unwilling to waver from their original sound. So,
right, or well, not necessarily unwilling, but maybe unable to. This is what they did. I mean, this is what they did, and the ones, and which is part of what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is all about, is longevity. Well, and of course, in those cases, plane crash ain't gonna happen. Longevity just isn't gonna happen. But so anyway,
interesting side before we move on about Buddy Holly, and I mentioned the song "It Doesn't Matter Anymore."
Yep.
I never knew this until I was doing some research, and of course, research helps. You learn something new every day. I say that, repeat that often. It was written by Paul Anka. And I never knew that. He was a teenager, I think 16 years old at the time that he wrote It Doesn't Matter Anymore. And he ended up, as a tribute to Buddy, he donated all of the royalties to Buddy's widow. That is also something I did not know. He took the songwriter royalties that he made for that song and donated them to Buddy's widow. And I thought, gee, what a gesture. And this kid at the time was a young kid. He wasn't like an older rock and roller or anything like that. I mean, he was 16, who he went on to fame, obviously, with Puppy Love and other songs. And then he also wrote the theme to The Tonight Show.
Yes.
That was Paul Anka's doing. So, yeah, he basically, based on his songwriting alone, the guy's probably a multimillionaire. I mean, he had some stuff in the late 50s, early 60s that he recorded and went top 40, but nothing that was like the impact of a lot of the Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. I'm guessing, and we'd have to look this up, that he could be in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Obviously, Paul Anka's not in the Rock Hall, but he could be in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, just based on writing those songs.
I mean, he did. Hang on, I'm trying to... Well,
I know we digress here, but I just thought it was an interesting side.
Okay, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Very interesting. And it did have to do with Buddy Holly. So, but onward.
Yes, we go.
The killer. the killer, Jerry Lee.
And he did an album, and I got a kick out of it. It said, "All Killer, No Filler."
Filler? I didn't even know her.
Yeah. We'll leave that in because that was good. And it was still clean. Yeah, because, I mean, he was a huge egotist, so it sounds like something he'd do, all killer and no filler.
Yeah.
Before we get into heavily deep into the subject of good old Jerry Lee, may he rest in peace, he once remarked that the greatest regret that he ever had throughout his lifetime was the fact that he could not sit in an audience and enjoy watching his show. In other words, as a member of the audience and not the performer. That's kind of give you an idea of his ego. Well, you know, my biggest regret in life, you know, is the fact that I couldn't sit and watch my own show.
Now, did he mean that in that he didn't have the pleasure of watching his own show?
Well,
or
I'm
that
sure pretty much.
Or he would sit out in the audience and go, "Oh my gosh, how's this guy getting away with this stuff?"
No, I think he meant like this would have been like my biggest thrill was to sit and watch myself in concert. Which, I mean, via video DVD he could, but it's not the same as sitting in the actual audience.
Well, because he really did think he was going to hell for all the music that he was playing and the way he was playing it. Like, he wouldn't even I mean, I sat there in a show and watched him tear a piano to shreds. And this was like with Johnny Cash and a country tour. And I mean, and he would play it with his hands, he would play it with his feet, his elbows, his rear end. Almost
his
said
buttocks.
His buttocks. I mean, and he'd climb up on top of the piano, and my father was just disgusted.
No kidding. I thought your dad would have a bit more open mind about that, knowing that was a southern, southern boy, fellow southern boy.
No, he didn't like that kind of stuff. He just, it's like. But then again, here's the thing, though, is that my father was wild when he was a kid. Okay, and I have noticed this is that men who are wild when they are young cannot stand to see wild kids of a later generation. It just drives them nuts. And
sort of an ego thing. I mean, we're getting off the subject here.
I don't know if it's
like I
don't know if it's an ego thing or if it's one of those about just kind of a mirror saying this is what I looked like at one time.
Oh my God, did I look that idiotic? Did I look that?
Yeah.
So
but.
And he once ended a show setting his piano on fire. That was back during the 50s when he was touring with like Chuck Berry and Elvis and Johnny Cash and that whole crew. And he took a bottle of Coke and filled it with gasoline, and then towards the end of the show lit his piano on fire and made the comment, because there were acts following him as he was doing it and then starting to walk off the stage, he said, "I'd like to see any son of a bitch follow that." So, which.
Yeah. Well, Chuck Berry could have.
Yeah, he could have. Yeah, Chuck Berry put on such a great show with the duck walk and everything that, he well could have. And I know we discussed Chuck another episode.
Yep.
But,
Yep. And, and the thing, too, about Jerry Lee is that his style of piano was more boogie. But as Elton John pointed out, Great Balls of Fire actually took the piano away from being this kind of sedate, Fats Domino kind of thing to really being a rock and roll instrument.
Sure.
I mean, he took it. Now, before that, with like the Fats Wallers and all that, it was that. But Jerry Lee was the one who took it from that into rock and roll.
Right. Yeah, Fats Domino was more like rhythm and blues edge, and then you had the New Orleans sound with like Fats and Professor Longhair and all those kind of. Dr. John, for that matter, was originated in the late 50s, early 60s with like that New Orleans sound of playing piano.
Yep.
Jerry Lee Lewis made it like he combined rockabilly and honky tonk and what was the word you used? The type of playing he was using. It all fits together.
Oh, a boogie?
Honky
boogie
tonk.
Piano,
Boogie woogie.
Boogie.
Yeah, boogie woogie, honky tonk, and rockabilly, and he kind of combined that sound and, just wailed away.
And he also brought in upbeat gospel, because he used to just go lay down outside the African American churches and listen to their gospel,
Right.
Whereas, because they would get down.
They would preach it.
They would preach it, absolutely. Yes. They would, everybody was in a frenzy.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, we would be remiss about, we were talking about that some of these artists would not have progressed. In Jerry Lee Lewis's case, his rock career kind of ended with kind of Myra Gale Brown.
His 13-year-old cousin that he married.
First cousin once removed that he married. Right. That he married, yeah. Yeah, that
Which was not unusual in the South at the time. I'm surprised there was such a reaction to it because
not
she
13.
was his. Well, she was his third wife, and his other two wives, even though he might have been in his late teens, early 20s, they were under the age of 16. I mean, his second wife was 15.
To marry, yeah.
Oh,
Didn't
I remember.
he have to go to England?
No, he got married
because...
here first, but there was some question as to whether he was divorced from his second wife.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
13,
he announced in
England
that he got married, and the English are like, they were just like shocked and disgusted, and they pretty much, just gave him the business his entire tour while he was in England, and then came back, and the song High School Confidential, which started out very well, ended up stalling at like number 21 because of the fact that controversy. It could have probably kept rising because it encapsulated what teenagers were doing and going to high school and stuff. Mm-hmm. But because of the flack and the negative feedback he took because of the 13-year-old bride business, ended up ultimately hurting him. So. Yeah, and there, I think I had mentioned it once before, but I'll bring this up again, and I never knew this, is that Jerry Lee didn't sell 1 million albums on one of it, or have a million-selling album or LP until he was age 77, and it was 77. Like 10 years ago. Yeah, he was 77 years old.
Oh, wow.
And
what was the name of that one?
Ironically, was called Last Man Standing. And it was named that because he was remembering himself as the only remaining member of the $1 Million Quartet, which was Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Elvis, and Jerry Lee. He was the lone survivor at the time he did the album, so it was called Last Man Standing. Never sold 1 million copies of any of his albums until then. And like how many years? Well, that was 2012, and he died last year, so he still lived another 10 years, a long, healthy life, 87. So,
87.
I mean, considering his drinking and his drug problems that you heard about over and over and over again over the decades, I think he was fortunate to live that long. But
and his temper. I mean, he had quite the temper, from what I understand. Heard some stories his cousin told. His cousin being Mickey Gilley.
Okay.
So. Told some tales, and it's really interesting. Is sometimes I'll hear like a Mickey Gilley song, and I'm like, "Damn, that sounds like Jerry Lee." And it's like, well, they're cousins, they're piano playing cousins, and so I guess there would be some similarities. But
wasn't he also cousin with Jimmy Lee Swaggart? Wasn't that his cousin as well?
Jimmy Swaggart, yes.
Well, I know Mickey Gilley was as well, but I mean, I just remember one of the preachers. Was a well-known preacher, evangelist, was Jimmy Lee or Jimmy Swaggart, and Jimmy and he were cousins. I don't know if they were first cousins or what the relationship was.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what the relationship is, but anyways, let's see. What else about Jerry Lee?
Well, he had songs including, I think it was Great Balls of Fire or A Whole Lot of Shaking Going On. I forget which. It was A Whole Lot of Shaking Going On. It hit number one on both the country, the pop, and the R&B charts, which nowadays would be unheard of. Virtually
it would be now.
Unheard of. And obviously because it did number one on all three, it sold like 6 million copies. Probably one of my favorites by him. Not an original. I have, in fact, once this radio station's up and running, I have the original Whole Lot of Shaking Going On. It's by a guy named Roy Hall. Sounds a little different. It's not like the big banging piano sound that Jerry Lee gives it. And the tempo's not quite as fast either, but it's an interesting version of the song. Also happens to be the first version of the song that, of course, Jerry Lee then came along and copied and made ever so popular. So,
and they recorded that in a little town called Osceola, Arkansas.
Oh, there you go.
About 18 miles from where my mom grew up, and of course, we'll get to this later, but of course, my mom grew up with Johnny Cash.
Yep, they were neighbors, even though they lived like 2 miles apart. They were neighbors.
They were neighbors. Yeah. Well, back then 2 miles, that's nothing. Of course, these days 2 miles is like up to the grocery store.
Is a country mile.
Anyway, it's a country mile. Yeah, there you go. All righty,
who we got next, my friend?
We got Richard Wayne Penniman.
Otherwise known as
1932, Little Richard. Yep. 1932 to 2020.
Oh, he'd have been. I didn't realize he was going to be that.
1932. 32.
So he was 9.
Not
he was
22.
80. Yeah, he was 80 something when he passed. 87 or 88,
87.
something like that when he passed away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he kind of outlived a lot of the other stars. Perkins, Cash, all of them. Little Richard lived kind of a wild lifestyle, but he was one that was willing to do stuff that was, other artists wouldn't have done. Like he performed with Canned Heat back in the 70s. He did that song for the movie Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. In fact, I saw it at the theater. I didn't keep it, of course, and I don't know why I didn't. It probably would be worth a crap load of money. But at the movie, they handed out a 45. When was that, like late 80s? They were still making 45s then. They handed out 45s of Little Richard's song Twins. And there was something on the flip side, which I forget what it was at this point. But I don't know. I should have held on to my 45s. I would have probably had a lot more money. But then again, I wouldn't have had room for them because, as you can see, the room behind me is kind of crowded with stuff. And it's enough just to store the CDs that I use, let alone all kinds of albums and 45s that I originally owned. I would have, I would have had to have an apartment twice as large as the one I currently live in. So.
Yeah, but the money that you tossed away with that would have bought you that apartment twice.
I would think so. I don't know of that much. I mean, there's probably still 1,000, 10,000 people out there that still have their copy. But then again, if you ever follow, and I know I'm digressing, but it's still musically related. If you've ever followed 45 collecting, the picture sleeves are worth more than the actual 45s. Because people had a habit, especially teenagers, female teenagers, but males as well. They'd get the record at home. It'd have the picture of the guys on the front, and of course they had their stacks of wax, as they called it. The 45s all piled up, one on top of each other, and so they would get rid of the cover sleeve and keep the record. And so when time came along for it to become collector's items, everybody had the 45s that they held on to. What nobody had was the cover sleeves, which are worth a lot more money if they're in mint shape than if you have a 45 in mint shape. So that's an interesting thing for all you people out there who kept your cover sleeves. Even if it had been artists like Springsteen and Prince and Joan Jett, those cover sleeves are probably worth more than the actual record. So
interesting, yeah. But yeah, it makes sense. Makes all kind of sense. Let's see. I mean, Little Richard was, I think the term folks used was frenetic.
To say the least.
Yeah. I mean, he would just pound those horse keys and yeah, gosh, I guess it would be kind of a battle between he and Jerry Lee as to who could pound the piano.
Pound the hardest.
Careful with
And
that.
interesting, David Bowie was not, and I say this again, he was not the first male rock and roll star to wear makeup when he performed in
That is
concert.
true. That is true. It would be Little Richard.
Right, it
I
was
mean,
Little
Little
Richard.
Richard, he, yeah, he was the first one to kind of bring.
Eyeshadow,
Yep.
lipstick, a little bit of coloring in the
Yeah.
cheek, and he had that
And
high, almost effeminate
yeah.
looking pompadour. So,
Well, he came. I mean, he came out later and said that he was gay.
right, I remember that. Wouldn't admit it
So,
until probably some point in like the 80s or 90s, but yeah.
well, he finally said he was in like '82, and then he said he
Okay, so
wasn't
there you go.
anymore. It was on David Letterman, actually.
Okay, got it. I was going to say it wasn't during the highlight of his career or the
No,
zenith
no,
of
he
his
wouldn't.
career.
He didn't say
or
that.
Even in the 70s, it was probably the 80s. So,
Yeah, because I mean, there was a huge, huge stigma back then, and that that stigma doesn't exist like that anymore. But
no.
but yeah, I mean, he had to keep it underground
Well,
back then.
Bowie was reluctant to admit it. And then now, even all these years later, towards the end of his life, he claimed, well, that was just for me to be able to sell records amongst the glam, you know, groupies and stuff that, that I was bisexual. But he
Yeah.
claims that he really never was gay. I mean, he was married, had children. So, yeah, he claimed that, if there was any sexuality outside of hetero, it was probably bisexual, and that wasn't his true choice or orientation. That it during his heyday in the early 70s, it helped him, or mid 70s, it helped him
Yeah.
sell records. So,
Right.
but
Yeah.
that's another subject because although it's quasi related to music and Little Richard, it stepped us away from Little Richard. So,
Well, yeah, and then of course, even keeping the two together, he managed to get some stuff, some sexual stuff, past the censors. Good golly, Miss Molly sure liked to ball. I mean, when we were in high school, balling was the term for fornicating.
right.
One of the terms.
Yeah, how that slipped by the censors, and even people to this day that are like record journalists and reviewers, they're like stumped. Like, how is it that I mean, that was what it meant. I mean, it wasn't talking about like
Yes.
going to a grand ballroom and dancing and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
He meant sexually,
Yes.
and it somehow zipped right by the censors.
Yep. Plug
How,
A
I
into
have no
socket
idea.
B. Plug A into socket B.
Well, if you ever
So-
knew Tutti Frutti, he actually had a young songwriter come in and help him rewrite that song. I think her name was Dorothy Lavastri, something like that. Who she had to clean up the original lyrics. His original lyrics were Tutti Frutti, good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. You can grease it and make it easy. And then she also cleaned up because at the end of the song he would say, "A wop bop a lula, a good goddamn." And so people, pardon my French, but that'll get by the censors. This is the internet, folks. But we're not going to go any deeper into
No, we're going to keep it at least
dirty
PG-13.
right. But yeah, that was the
So-
original lyrics, and he had to have her step up so he could release the song because there was no way the record company's Specialty Records at the time was going to release a song that said that. So they had him change a lyric. He went to a lady he knew, and he said, here's the song as I originally wrote it. Clean up the lyrics for me. So
Right.
I don't know if she got a writing credit on it or not. I'd have to look into that. That's pretty
Yeah.
interesting.
That's
Or
kind
he
of a
paid her
gray
like
area
one
there.
time. He might have paid her
Yeah.
just like one time, like here's $10,000, clean it up for me. Or back
Yeah,
then it
like
would probably been $1,000.
Just like a line editor or something.
Right. She may not have gotten royalties. I'd have to look that up to see if it's listed on the 45 or not. But yeah, that's interesting.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Let's see. Little Richard wasn't just influential though in rock and roll. I mean, funk. I mean, gosh, I think even hip hop can trace its roots back to Little Richard.
The persona or the songs, the
No, the
heavy,
persona.
funky beat. Oh, okay.
Yeah, the persona. No, the music's obviously different, but but
Yeah, glam
I think
rock
they can
was
trace it.
influenced too, like Bowie and
Yeah,
T-Rex and
right.
all those, Lou Reed to a degree, where they put the makeup and stuff on, and Slade, all these
Yep.
groups that did that to get by during the early to mid '70s, especially in England. Not so big over here as much.
Yeah. Yeah, and he was described as the architect of rock and roll.
Self-described, I thought. Did somebody actually
Self-described.
describe him, or did he just say, "I'm the architect"?
I.
I don't
That's a good
remember.
question. That's a good question. I don't know.
We'll have to do further research. We'll have an answer for you next time. By the way, in case you didn't
Yeah.
get those answers to those questions, and I guess I can go out and get them here,
All right.
because I don't know if we were able to retain that portion of the podcast or not. But the answer to the questions about who was the first female inducted, and it'll be the class. All you have to do is look at the rock and roll class of '87, because at that
Yep.
year she was the only
Yep.
female inducted, which was Aretha
Aretha.
Franklin. And
Yep.
then the first group to be inducted, also '87, that wasn't like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Little Richard on his
Yep.
own, Jerry Lee Lewis on his own, was the Coasters. They came in as a group rather than individuals. So that was the answer to those two trivia questions. But if you see the earlier broadcast, give that a look-see.
Well, I'll see if I can splice a couple of those together there.
Yeah, and then
See what
give
we
them
can
the
do.
answer later or something. We'll see. That's on our end, folks. That's not for you to worry about.
Yeah, it's behind the scenes stuff there, but I guess next time we'll save the last performer, the class of 1986, for the next one, which will be Elvis Presley.
And he deserves his own show. I hate to say it, we're not trying to single Elvis out, but the influence the guy had was immeasurable. The way that rock and roll became a lifestyle, a form of music that probably because of the way he popularized it, he deserves a show of his own. He had something, I believe, the top 100 Billboard chart book that I have. I'd have to double check it, but I believe he has like over 140 songs or 160, somewhere in that neighborhood, that hit the top 100. So, I mean, that guy was prolific. And, I mean, if you figure it, he only basically lived until the late 70s. So by that I mean the late 1970s, not age-wise. He was only 42 when he passed. So everything
Yeah.
he did was like 50s, 60s, and then some degree into the early to mid-70s. But, yes, he put out a ton of songs, many of which he didn't write himself, if not all. I can't remember an Elvis song he might have written himself.
I think he's got a minor songwriting credit for like Heartbreak Hotel, but other than that, no, he was a performer.
Right.
He was an entertainer. He was not a songwriter at all.
And that could be our next trivia question about there's three artists, or is it two? Two artists that have made both the songwriter, the country, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fames. There's only two.
That is
two
correct.
performers that have done
Yep.
that. That would be, and Elvis was not
Yep.
one of them.
Elvis was not
John?
one of them.
If John Cougar Mellencamp had been on in fact, I'm virtually positive I know he's in the Rock Hall, and I know he's
Yeah.
in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. I don't know what he
Yep.
did in terms of country. Some of his songs may have crossed over because of their sound, but I don't think he's in the Country Hall of Fame. So he would not be.
Yeah, but the two that are, I mean, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would have been, well, one of them was an early influence,
Right.
and then the other one actually was helped found rockabilly. So he said, just giving away some clues there. But
And not only that, but a lot of his songs crossed over to the country charts.
yes, and before we sign off, you can contact us via email at rockandrollofages@gmail.com, on Twitter at rockrollages. We have a Facebook page. We're hoping to start a web page And so definitely contact us there.
And look
like
us
our
on up.
Facebook page and look us up. Yeah. All right.
We're here to entertain you, inform you, educate you, and hopefully just give you a good time. So tune in.
Yep.
On that note, Rocky, have a great afternoon. I will see you when we next record.
Actually, hang on to recording. Let me just close the recording up. Okay, bye, folks. We'll see y'all
Bye.
next time.
See you, folks. Take care.